Good afternoon. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Cecelia Klein. I'm going to be moderating session number 2, the title of which is Deviance and the Super/Natural. And I assumed that they gave that session to me because I have written about deviance. We have 3 great speakers today, and the first one I happen to know is going to talk more about flowers, and that's Lisa Sousa. She is currently professor of history at Occidental College in Eagle Rock out here, and she is there the chair of Latino, and Latin American Studies, the director of the Keck program for undergraduate research in the arts, humanities, and social sciences. And she's written extensively, as I'm sure many of you know, on women and gender issues pertaining to the indigenous peoples of Latin America, especially those in Oaxaca and central Mexico. And she's currently working on a book on indigenous women in 16th and 17th century highland central Mexico. It's not on central Mexico, right? It's highland Mexico, okay. And that will be published by the Stanford University Press. In 2002, this is just to show you how she ended up in this session. She published an article in the journal The Americas, which was titled The Devil and Deviance in Native Criminal Narratives from Early Mexico. And that shows her commitment to the theme. Today, she's going to talk on discourses on deviance in the Florentine Codex. So welcome, Lisa.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I wanted to just begin by thanking the organizers. As some of you may know, I'm married to Kevin, so I had a behind-the-scenes seat to watch the 2 years of hard work that both Jeanette and Kevin put into planning the conference. And so really I think on behalf of all the presenters, we're so thankful for all of the dedication and time you put into this. Today I'm happy to talk about discourses on deviance in the Florentine Codex. And let me begin with a quote from Book 10. In Book 10 of the Florentine Codex, a Nahua author described the procuress's ability to use arousing speeches, incantations, and spells to lure clients. She is a charmer, a sweet talker, a smooth talker. She is of pleasing, agreeable speech. She is soft-spoken. Her words are flowers, sweet, pleasing. She is an artful, skilled speaker, a master of discourse. The Nahua author drew upon 2 symbols of seduction, speech and flowers, to convey the procuress's ability to tempt others and to promote illicit sex. The Nahuatl language warning is just one of 3 distinct commentaries on the subject of how a procuress leads people astray. The accompanying translation and illustration can be considered separate texts that express related concepts and concerns, but that vary significantly in their presentation of the procuress. Similarities and discrepancies in the descriptions and images of procurers, prostitutes, and cross-dressers, among other social deviants, shed light on the Nahua Christian dialogue on immorality in the 16th century. Previous scholarship, especially the work of Louise Burkhart, Barry Sell, Fritz Schwaller, Mark Christensen, and Kevin Teresiano, has revealed the complex process in which indigenous concepts of morality informed local Christian beliefs in New Spain. Their research, based on the study of native language church texts, such as confessional manuals, sermons, catechisms, and plays, has shown how the friars' reliance on indigenous languages to evangelize promoted the incorporation of indigenous moral concepts and attitudes into Christianity, and gave rise to unique regional forms of Catholicism. Cecelia Klein's pioneering work with images, material objects, and colonial texts reveal moral attitudes related to the body and gender ambiguity. Margaret Arvey, Jeanette Peterson, Pete Siegel, and Guilhem Olivier have examined European influences on some of the images and texts in Book 10 concerning women of ill repute, the hermaphrodite, and the homosexual. This essay contributes to the scholarship on morality, gender, and sexuality by analyzing a range of texts and images found in multiple books of the Florentine Codex, and especially Book 10, to shed light on speech and flowers as Nahua symbols of moral transgression, and to reveal the persistence of these concepts in Nahua verbal and visual expression after the conquest. In particular, I examine how discourses on deviance feature speech and flowers as metaphors for illicit sexuality and immorality more generally. These pervasive, powerful Nahua symbols appear in both the Nahuatl language texts and images, but are glossed over in the Spanish translation. The pictorials betray significant European influence while retaining an underlying coherence in Nahua ideology, and in some cases, the artists, or the tlacuilos, attempted to innovate upon Mesoamerican writing conventions by incorporating phonetic elements that go beyond expressing place names and personal names. When the Nahuatl texts, Spanish translations, and images are read against one another, they reveal how multiple understandings of deviance operated in the early colonial period, and how writers and artists employed a variety of strategies to convey moral danger. Book 10 of the Florentine Codex covers several interrelated themes, including kinship, age, and occupation, parts of the human body, illness and medicines, and brief descriptions of various ethnic groups that inhabit New Spain. Much of the material was gathered through interviews with elders and nobles in Tepepulco, Tlatelolco, and Tenochtitlan. Sahagún's educated and Christianized Nahua co-authors apparently asked them to describe different social types and their traits. The manuscript contains roughly 204 social categories based on age, kinship, and occupation. In the first 20 chapters, each with multiple entries, the text provides the characteristics and qualities of a good and bad person in each category. However, there are 16 social types that did not have a positive side associated with them. So already in creating these categories, Sahagún and his aides must have discussed which types of people would be identified as social deviants who lacked any redeeming qualities, and they must have decided the labels to assign to these groups. We might assume that Sahagún dictated this process. However, the description of the Nahuali, which the friars associated with the devil, includes good and bad types. This suggests that Nahua authors played a significant role in determining the categories. From the beginning, then, there is some redefinition of pre-Hispanic social categories to fit a Christian moral framework. The work of Guilhem, Olivier, Cecelia, Klein, and Pete Siegel speak more directly to this topic. The imposition of good-bad distinctions following European frameworks of virtues and vices, or good and evil, further reveals the Nahua Christian dialogue in determining the structure of the book and its chapters. Mesoamerican cultures, with their rich oral traditions, invested speaking with considerable political and social power. The Nahua ruler was a Tlatoani, one who speaks, and the Florentine Codex tells us that the ideal noblewoman was of elegant speech, soft-spoken, a gentle person, peaceful, refined. She speaks with elegance. One way that nobles distinguished themselves from commoners was by using reverential, metaphorical language. They also gave moralizing speeches at both life cycle rituals and other public events to instill a strong ethical code among their families and communities. And here we see the Nahua noble father addressing his sons in the top frame and daughters in the bottom frame. Numerous examples of the Huehuetlatoli emphasize moderation, humility, responsibility to others, sexual fidelity, and respect for elders as primary virtues. Colonial records and texts reveal that Nahuas possessed a highly developed genre of speech related to intimacy and courtship. In some contexts, the act of speaking represented intercourse. In a moralizing speech in Book 6, a Nahua father advises his son that if he foolishly wastes his semen by indulging in sex at an early age, his sexual performance would suffer later in life. He warns him that the time would come when you are no longer able to say anything, no longer able to do anything to your spouse. The association between sex and speech is explicit in his admonition. In another example, a lewd youth is characterized as a womanizer and a smooth talker. He is deemed a keeper of mistresses, a talker. He lives in concubinage. The placement of the statement, he is a talker, between the phrases, he is a keeper of mistresses and he lives in concubinage, associates his talking with sex. The section on cross-dressers in Book 10 discusses how men or women could change their identities by adopting markers of the opposite gender, such as clothing, hairstyle, speech patterns, and labor duties. Highlighting the importance of speech as a gender marker, the text begins, the cross-dresser, or Xochihua, has feminine speech, has a feminine way of talking, and if a woman has masculine speech, has a masculine way of talking. In concluding this section, the Nahua writer re-emphasizes that Xochihua speaks like a woman, pretends to be a woman. The phrase, he pretends to be a woman, suggests that his mode of speech is used to deceive and seduce others. Similarly, the hermaphrodite, or patlache, befriends lots of women and speaks like a man. Because the text states that the hermaphrodite has a penis, the statement that the patlache speaks like a man may suggest that he or she has sex like a man. Nahuatl language descriptions of the procurer and the procuress emphasize their abilities to deliver salacious discourses. In fact, it is principally through speech that the procurer is said to have led clients astray. The procurer is a mouse, a charmer, a windbag, an enticer, a possessor of flowers, one who seduces people with flowery words, one who flatters people with pleasing words, one who poisons people. He entices, he poisons people. He stretches out long-winded speeches. He summons people with spells. He lays ambushes for people. The Nahuatl language description of the procuress, with its multiple references to the power of speech, is also worth quoting at length. The procuress is a charmer, a sweet talker, a smooth talker. She is of pleasing, agreeable speech, soft-spoken. Her words are flowers, sweet, pleasing. She is an artful, skilled speaker, a master of discourse. She is one who flatters, tricks, and induces people with pleasing words. She is one who entices, entrances, and lulls people with incantations. She is a cajoler, one who summons people with spells, one who destroys people with sorcery, one who places obstacles so that others will stumble. She stretches out long-winded speeches. She converses deceitfully. She tricks people with pleasing words. She lulls one with words. She perverts, provokes, confuses, corrupts people. She fools people. She induces people. She induces people with spells. She lulls people with incantations. She entrances people. The elaborate descriptions of the procurers emphasize the seductive nature of speech and the power that procurers and procuresses wielded through their command of language. The text concerning the procuress uses 22 verbs to convey her skills at deceiving and entrapping others with her discourse. Many of the descriptions of social deviance in Book 10 also convey moral concepts using the flower as a symbol of temptation, seduction, and illicit sexuality. In Mesoamerica, flowers convey a broad range of concepts and meanings. Diana Magaloni introduced us to some of the symbolism of flowers in her talk this morning. In metaphorical speech and iconography concerning morality, flowers represent potency, fertility, and reproduction. As symbols of fertility and productive sexuality, flower imagery was evoked in speeches made at life cycle rituals. Nahua elders and honored guests spoke of children as flowers when they addressed the bride and groom at the marriage ceremony. The Nahua bride was told if she were fortunate, she would have children who would, quote, bloom and flower from her womb and throat, unquote. While flowers might represent reproduction in certain contexts, in others they symbolize the destructive aspects of sexual excess and illicit relations. Nahuatl language expressions recorded in the Florentine Codex suggest the negative connotations of flowers, as for example in the Nahuatl phrase, I caress one with flowers, which means I seduce him or her. Similarly, the expression, I destroy one with flowers, which means to entice one with drink, with food, with flowers, with tobacco, with capes, with gold. In both cases, flowers signify temptation, decadence, and forbidden pleasures. Molina's dictionary also includes the term xochihuilla, based upon xochitl or flower, which means to enchant, to seduce the woman with pleasing words in order to take her to another place or to bewitch her. The Nahua association between sexual disease and certain flowers, including the white amaryllis and the poinsettia, reinforces the potentially destructive nature of flowers. The Nahua author of the section on the procurer employs 3 terms based on Xochitl, describing him as a possessor of flowers, one who seduces people with flowery words, one who flatters people with flowery words. Similarly, the procuress's words are flowers. Flowers serve as symbols of sexual transgression in the Nahuatl term xochihuilla, literally possessor of flowers, used in Book 10 for a cross-gendered person and for a procurer. Likewise, the prostitute appears like a flower. These abundant examples reveal the many ways in which Nahua writers drew upon traditional concepts in their discussions of immorality in the Florentine Codex. Whereas Nahuas continued to associate moral danger with inappropriate or flowery speech and seduction by flowers, a single reference to the Christian devil in the description of the procuress shows how they began to attribute social deviance to the devil's malicious influences. Even then, however, the Christian devil appears as one of a long list of malevolent supernaturals. The procuress, one who procures. The procuress is truly a Tlatelolco. The Tlatelolco truly lives within her, truly hides within her. She is truly the Nawali of the Tzitzimi, the Kololetli. The deceiver is truly the eyes, the ears, the messenger of the devil, the Tzitzimi. The writer sensed a need to elaborate on the European devil by defining him as a type of destructive Nahua supernatural. In doing so, however, the threat seems to come more from Nahua supernaturals than from the devil himself. It is surprising that there are not more references to the devil in these commentaries, considering that the Nahua authors were living among Franciscans and that sermons, confessional manuals, and plays often blamed immorality and sin on the devil. The critical statements in Book 10 concerning homosexuals or quiloni, and the conclusion that they deserve to be burned, surely reveals a Christian influence. Spanish officials in New Spain did burn homosexuals on occasion. However, sources on pre-conquest justice do not refer to the execution of homosexuals, and there is no evidence that burning was a form of punishment for social deviance among the Nahuas in pre-conquest times. Clearly then, the Nahua authors adopted this view from their Spanish mentors. Some Nahua social categories did not fit European conceptual frameworks, and we encounter the same difficulty translating these terms into English. For example, awiyani, one who indulges in pleasure, was a term for a woman who lived and danced in the temple in pre-conquest times, among other ritual functions. The friars adopted this term for the Spanish puta, or whore, clearly demoting a woman who participated in sacred rituals to a prostitute who sells her sexuality. In his refutation of idolatry, Sahagún also uses the term awiyani when he denounces the, quote, filth goddesses, denigrating them as nothing more than harlots. Prostitute in English perpetuates the distortion of the meaning of the original term while expressing the intent of the colonial text. Similarly, the Nahua authors assign the label Xochihua, or possessor of flowers, to men and women described as cross-dressers, although this term is used more generally for a person who promotes or engages in illicit sex, as for example, as it's used in the description for the procurer. Sahagún translates Xochihua as embaucador or embaucadora, deceiver, which fails to represent the metaphorical meaning of the term. Nahuatl nouns were not gendered, so the term for procurer and procuress is the same. Tlatelolco or Tlatelolco. Translations into Spanish and English gender the term according to context. Many Nahua moral concepts did not have a Spanish equivalent, and therefore Sahagún did not attempt to translate them literally. In fact, in some sections, he did not reproduce much of the repetition that drove home the point of the text. For example, whereas the Nahua author used over 20 terms to describe the procuress's ability to lead others astray with her enticing words, Sahagún summarizes her command of speech in a single statement. She is very rhetorical in her speech, using delightful words in order to deceive. She goes about offering the women like roses, and in this way she brings them with her sweet words to stupefied and entranced men. The 22 lines of Nahuatl that describe the procuress are reduced to 12 lines of Spanish. Similarly, the Spanish text downplays the power of the procurer to bring harm. There is no mention of his ability to poison or ambush people. Whereas the translation does allude to the procurer's ability to seduce women, Sahagún streamlined the more elaborate Nahuatl description and stated succinctly, he deceives women with his beautiful speech, linda plática. The 4 Nahuatl language terms that refer to flowers in the description of the procurer's speech are summarized as, the procurer uses deceits and falsehoods that are like roses that please men with their beauty and good scent. Sahagún's translation fails to tap into the metaphorical power of speech and flowers as tropes for seduction and illicit sexuality. Sahagún also renders the term Xochitl as rose when he states the prostitute appears like a rose. For a Spanish reader, references to roses might have evoked the practice of love magic and the belief that the lovelorn could attract lovers by casting spells on roses. At times, Sahagún introduced concepts that would resonate with a Spanish audience that are not included in the Nahuatl text. For example, in the description of the Awiani, the Nahua writer discusses how these women have the custom of walking around and chewing chicle to freshen their breath. In Sahagún's translation of this section, he adds, "When they chew chicle, their teeth sound like castanets." He repeats this in the description of the chicle chewer. The public women, without any shame whatever, walk around chewing chicle in all the places, in the streets, in the markets, clacking their teeth like castanets. His commentary seems to be more concerned with manners than morality. Sahagún did not feel the need to comment on morality in these sections of the manuscript, even though this would be the ideal place for him to have done so. Furthermore, he does not attribute certain behaviors to the devil unless it is introduced in the Nahuatl, which is something that we might have anticipated. Thus, while he often summarizes the Nahuatl, Sahagún does not veer entirely away from the original text, except in a very few places. In their studies of women of ill repute in the Florentine Codex, Margaret Arvey and Jeanette Peterson have pointed out European influences on the depiction of prostitutes. Arvey identified the poses, hand gestures, and flowing hair as evidence that Nahuatl Tlaquilos drew from European models. Jeanette Peterson also noted the harlot's red shoes and golden cup, which were symbols of dissolute women in European paintings and texts. While I agree with Arvey and Peterson's observations, it is worth reconsidering how the native artists also drew upon Nahua symbolism and moral concepts to convey immorality and deviance in these and other images in Book 10. Nahuatl Tlaquilos place interaction in specific settings to differentiate between appropriate and inappropriate behaviors and positive and negative influences. Images that show parents, nobles, or elders making speeches are set in the household or temple complex. In Nahua society, the household was a moral unit, and together members of a household socialized and raised their children. The adults of the household monitored each other's behavior to ensure that moral transgressions would not threaten the stability or health of the family. This convention is used in other manuscripts, including the Codex Mendoza, here showing the marriage ceremony, but you can see the lines around are indicating that after the procession, the ritual takes place within the household. And you can also note here the elders, right, who are making speeches to address the young woman here on the left and the young man. And then just note how the women are speaking to the girl and the men are facing and speaking to the young man, right, to the groom. Furthermore, in scenes that show parents, elders, and nobles making moralizing speeches, the Nahua painters conveyed the proper social order and social harmony by the seating arrangements. The composition of the images represent idealized complementary relations between women and men, elders and youth. On the other hand, Nahua artists depicted all scenes showing deviant behavior in a generic countryside, far from the watchful eyes of the community and household members. In locating certain activities outside of the community, Nahuatl Tlaquilos drew upon associations of the periphery with moral danger that were not directly expressed in the text. In the images from Book 10 concerning social deviance, they are almost all shown standing. Only the trader is laying down, and we'll see him in a minute, and the man who propositions the prostitute in this image sits on a little seat. But just note this as we look at the rest of the images, that they're all outside and everyone is standing up. Many of the depictions of social deviance reinforce the fundamental importance of speech and flowers in Nahua moral discourse. Although the images do not show every detail discussed in the corresponding Nahuatl text, and sometimes they introduce distinct information and concepts. As a corpus, the iconography in Book 10 highlights speech and flowers as moral signifiers. One image, the image here, shows a client kneeling before and offering money to a prostitute. A speech scroll emerges from his mouth, indicating that he propositions her with pleasing words. Jeanette Peterson noted the prominence of the road in the image, which corresponds to the description of the prostitute as one who wanders shamefully along the road. In addition, I would point out that the scene is placed at a crossroads, Otlamashali, literally crotch of the road, a location specifically associated with illicit sexuality, sorcery, and the underworld, as well as with the Siwa Teteo. Likewise, others who commit transgressions appear in a generic rural landscape with speech scrolls to reinforce the idea that it is through the power of speech that these delinquents confuse and deceive others. We can see this, for example, in the depiction of the drunkard. I love this guy. He's just had a little too much, but he's literally wallowing in the filth, right? He is literally covered with tlazoli, and he has his very prominent speech scroll. He also has very crazy wild hair, which is another moral signifier. We see this in the depiction of the trader, who's literally speaking to two different groups saying two different things, right? Also, the gossip, the Makishkoat, right, who is here shown with very prominently with the speech scroll. Even when the Nahua artist does not include speech scrolls, figures making hand gestures and looking directly at one another in the eyes indicate communication, negotiation, and speech. Several images also incorporate flowers to represent promiscuity. Arvey considered the abundant flowers in these illustrations as further evidence of Christian influence. However, as multivalent and bicultural symbols, I would argue that in this context, a Nahuatl would use flowers to convey concerns with seduction, temptation, and illicit sex, and that he may even have used them as phonetic indicators to suggest certain terms that appear in the alphabetic text to the reader of the images. The Nahuatl depicted the hermaphrodite wearing a married woman's hairstyle and a man's cape to convey gender ambiguity and bisexuality. The elaborate speech scroll calls particular attention to the phrase in the Nahuatl text, "She speaks like a man," shown here in conversation with a seated woman who has a flower speech scroll emerging from her mouth. So you could just make out here this little flowery speech scroll. And as we talked about this morning, more stylized flowers do sometimes appear on speech scrolls, but to convey other ideas like poetry. These details situate their belonging to a broader conceptual framework of moral danger and illicit sexuality. An illustration of the procurer may even depict his enticing speech or his Xochihuilisli as a small flower here. And I want to come back to this image because I'm not entirely sure. But it's interesting to note that in the marriage prognostication scene, this couple who is clearly headed for a violent relationship, the woman has this flower speech, I'm assuming speech right in front of her mouth. Nahua artists show prostitutes holding flowers as symbols of sexual impropriety and sometimes wearing flowers. Flowered clothing, although sometimes worn by indigenous men and women without any inherently negative connotations, conveys overt sexuality and seduction when worn by prostitutes, the wicked old man, and the wicked noble. The image of the Xochihua, or cross-dressers, shows two seated individuals, one in the clothing of a man and one dressed as a woman with speech scrolls in front of their mouths. The woman wears the traditional hairstyle, or woman I should say, of an adult Nahua woman, and the man's hair is cropped with bangs in the European fashion of the time. The flower or Xochitl between them is a phonetic indicator that they are Xochihuaque, or possessors of flowers. Some of the European influences in the Nahuatl text are also conveyed in the images. For example, an illustration showing the execution of a homosexual by burning corresponds to the statement in the Nahuatl text that sanctions is punishment for same-sex relations. The depiction of the devil in the scene showing the procuress complements the description in the Nahuatl and Spanish text of the procuress as the eyes, the ears, the messenger of the devil, the tzitzimi. However, whereas the Nahuatl described the devil as one of several Nahua supernaturals, the illustration only shows the European devil. Perhaps by the time the image was produced, Nahuas were familiar enough with the concept of the European devil that he alone would do, and it may be that the friars would not tolerate the depiction of other gods and powerful supernaturals in this context. Or perhaps the Nahuatl Tlaquilo modeled the image on European images in paintings and books. As one final observation, I find it particularly interesting that the Nahuatl Tlaquilos who produced these images seem to have innovated with pictorial writing, extending traditional techniques and symbols. We often focus on the European influence in images in our analysis of the change in the pictorial writing tradition in the 16th century. But the Nahuatl Tlaquilos seem to have been very interested in innovating within the more traditional practices of post-classic Mesoamerican writing systems. For example, many of the images have phonetic elements. Here with the Makishkoat, right, which literally means bracelet snake, and Makishkoat's the term for the gossip. Also, this is shown, for example, here, where the Tlaquilo actually depicts some of the nouns that are used to describe the procurer. And in this way, it's almost functioning like a name glyph, right? It's near his head. And so here, I'm not sure about this Xochitl, if it's supposed to indicate speech, or if it's, remember that he's described as a Xochihua, a possessor of flowers, and as a mouse, right? He's a mouse. Okay, let's see. There are also these interesting elaborations on some of the speech scrolls. So, for example, there's this wispiness that's here on the speech scrolls, and maybe this has something to do with some of the things we've been talking about in terms of heat or scent and so forth. I also believe that the flower elements on clothing or bouquets held by figures and the water element in depictions of prostitutes are further attempts to innovate with phonetic writing in the pictorials of the Florentine Codex. Nahuatl texts on social deviance reveal a moral complex that shaped understandings of appropriate and inappropriate behavior. Speech and flowers were just two of the many symbols that constituted this expansive moral framework. If Christian beliefs began to seep into Nahua moral ideology, it did not replace traditional values, beliefs, and attitudes entirely. A close reading of the Nahuatl text, Spanish translations, and Nahua images reveals a rich intellectual, cultural, and moral exchange of ideas, concepts, and symbols in 16th century Mexico. In these sections of the Florentine Codex, Sahagún rather faithfully translated the Nahuatl, yet he omitted some of the symbolism in terms for seduction and immoral behavior, and he often eliminated the repetition of certain concepts in the Nahuatl text. Occasionally, he elaborated on the original Nahuatl by adding descriptions that would make sense to a Spanish reader. The linguistic and cultural exchange that produced the Florentine Codex also created ambiguous and problematic categories that were intended to conform to Christian morality. The characterization of social deviance, for example, often relied on Nahuatl nomenclature that did not possess inherently negative connotations in pre-conquest times. This finding complements the work of Louise Burkhardt, which shows how Spanish adoption of certain Nahuatl terms to express basic Christian themes and terms, such as the use of Mictlan for hell or Tlatelolco for sin, distorted the original concept and often led to confusion. The images, added last to the manuscript, seem to negotiate between Spanish and Nahua worldviews. The Tlaquilos seem to have innovated with pictorial and phonetic writing to express moral concepts. While European influence on the style and content of the images is clear, underlying indigenous concepts and metaphors permeate Nahua verbal and visual expression in the Florentine Codex. Thank you.
I'm a very poor disciplinarian. And I realize sitting down here, they can't see me anyway, so that's a warning to you, Guilhem. Our next speaker is Guilhem Olivier, who is a professor in the graduate program in history at the Universidad Nacional Autónoma de Mexico, or UNAM, as we call it up here. He's also a full-time tenured researcher in pre-Hispanic history in the Instituto de Investigaciones, Históricas, also at UNAM. A lot of you probably know him as the author of a magnum opus on the Aztec god Tlatelolco, which he first published in France in 1997. And then it was translated into Spanish for a 2004 edition, published in Mexico, and then translated again into English for a 2008 publication published by the University of Colorado Press. He's impressively prolific. There would be no way in the world I could sum up all of the subjects that he has touched upon in his writing. But suffice it to say, he's co-edited a substantial number of books. He's edited special issues of several major journals. He has dozens of articles that he's written on the Nahua, many of them on topics directly related to this session. He's written about indigenous eroticism, morality, homosexuality, prostitution, and divination. Today, I think we're going to see another side of this. He's been more recently working on the gods, and so we're sort of switching more into the supernatural, or super/natural. And so the talk today is on teot, that word that we wrestled with a little earlier. I meant to tell you that years ago I heard a talk by Charles Dibble here in Los Angeles, and he told the audience that he thought that the best translation of teot was extraordinary. And I like that because it could be extraordinarily good or extraordinarily bad. It was exceptional, something exceptional. And I've thought about that ever since because it fits everything. So I think he nailed it. I don't think he ever published it. So Guilhem's going to touch on that and also on the Diablo. The subtitle is Indigenous and Christian Conceptions of the Gods in the Florentine Codex by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún and his Nahua informants. So here you go.
Good afternoon. It's an honor for me to be there, and I want to thank you, Janet and Kevin, for inviting me. Although specific books in the Florentine Codex are devoted to the god, pre-Hispanic deities are omnipresent in the texts, both in Spanish and Nahuatl, as well as in the illustration throughout the magnum opus compiled by Fray Bernardino de Sahagún and his Nahua informants. In fact, the first 3 books of the Florentine Codex are dedicated to the description of the goats and their insignia, the feast day where they were venerated, and the origin of the goats, which we might call their myth. The next 2 books deal with the divinatory calendar and the divine influences that make themselves manifest on specific days, signs of the 260-day Tlatelolco Valley, and the omens and evils that characterize the intervention of the gods under special circumstances. And let's not forget that book 6 on rhetoric and moral philosophy begins with prayers addressed to Tezcatlipoca and Tlaloc, and then the 7th contains a renowned myth on the origin of the sun and moon. Whereas the books 8, 9, and 10 address more mundane matters related to Nahua society, they nevertheless include important data on the gods of the Posteca or merchants, as well as the deities venerated by various ethnic groups described at the end of Book 10. As Book 11, even though it is presented as a natural encyclopedia, it also contains a number of allusions to the native gods in addition to images of supernatural beings, such as this peculiar representation of Huitzilopochtli. Finally, the indigenous version of the conquest in the celebrated 12th book contains valuable accounts of ritual, such as those carried out during the 20-day Veintena of Toxcatl, and a remarkable description of the appearance of Tezcatlipoca, Lord of Smoking Mirror, revealing to Moctezuma terrified envoys the apocalyptic visions of their capital city of Tenochtitlan in flame. Without doubt, the indigenous gods were the subject that Sahagún devoted the most space and attention to throughout his work. This omnipresence of the gods in the Sahagún oeuvre obeys 2 complementary reasons. On the one hand, the supreme interest of the Franciscan missionary in the idolatry practiced by the native population that he intended to eradicate, and on the other hand, the role played by the gods in the indigenous world, gods that permeate all aspects of life. As is widely known, the purpose of Sahagún's work was to make known to, I quote, preachers and confessors, physicians of the souls, the spiritual ailments such as the sins of idolatry, idolatrous rituals, idolatrous superstitions, auguries, abuses, and idolatrous ceremonies that are not yet completely lost. To carry out this purpose, it was necessary to have a command on the Nahuatl language, as Fray Bernardino points out in the prologue to the general history. This work is like a dragnet to bring to light all the words of this language, with their exact and metaphorical meanings, and all the ways of speaking, and most of the ancient practices, the good and evil. Cecelia, in exhaustively recording the words of the Nahuatl language, naturally extended to the numerous members of the Nahuatl pantheon. In fact, alongside gods well known through other sources, such as Huitzilopochtli, Tlaloc, Quetzalcoatl, Tezcatlipoca, and so forth, we find other deities which, if it were not for the Franciscan work, would remain completely unknown. As far as I know, the only references to Xiutlali and Xilo, the goddesses of feather artisans, came from the Florentine Codex. Similarly, Sahagún's informants, some of whom were most likely linked to the Posteca Guild, provide a long list of the numens that they venerated: Yacatecutli, Cocoximetl, Yacapitzahuac, Xiconquiahuatl, Xalmecasihuatl, Axmoquil, Naxitl, etc. Furthermore, Nahuatl texts, prayers for example, present the rich divine nomenclature associated with one deity or another. Tezcatlipoca is presented under the name of Tlitlacahuan, Yaotl, Necoquiaotl, Quelpochtli, Yohualiejecatl, Semiquistli, and Omeacatl, as well as his name linked to the supreme deity, Mononequi, Moyocoyani, Tloquenahuaque, Ipalnemowani, and others. As for Xiutecutli, this igneous deity was also called Huehueteotl, Ixcosauqui, Quetzaltin, Tota, Nahuiotecutli, Ocotecutli, Nahuiacatl, and so forth. Now then, in addition to discovering the countless visages beneath which the devil concealed himself, Sahagún attempted to prevent the indigenous people from adopting these pagan names. Indeed, by speaking of the four aspects of the goddess Tlatelolco, Sahagún explained, of these four goddesses, they took and still take their names for Mexican women, which are Tiacapan, Teicu, Tlacu, Xuco. It is better to remove them. At the same time, after listing the 12 pork goats, the friar states that until today, these diabolical names endured among the noblemen. Names, as well as divine representation, were captured in Sahagún's work. Thus, we have a list of elements of attire recorded in Nahuatl, and above all, a rich iconography that has been the object of considerable study. Despite the fact it was influenced by Western tradition, the representations of the gods in the Primeros Memoriales and the Florentine Codex adhere to the ancient pictographic tradition. Other images illustrate the appearance of deity at times under the guise of their animals' doubles and their performance during myth, such as the birth of Huitzilopochtli or Quetzalcoatl heroic deeds in Tolan. The Tlatelolco painted acts of devotion and offering, as well as the unfolding of ritual feast days that feature the participation of the Ixiptla, who were slaves and war captives who personified the gods. What attracts our attention is the fact that even when showing the production of statues or the veneration to which they were dedicated, the divine representations are always depicted as living persons. Although some of the painted figures are Ixiptla, in other cases, this systematic anthropomorphism seems to respond to a strategy that consisted of stripping divinity from pre-Hispanic gods, in other words, in presenting them as common men. We will see that this iconographic strategy has its parallels in the text with Sahagún usage of the theory of ephemeris. The diabolical figures that Sahagún's informants called Diablome and even Diablosme, using the Spanish term with a Nahuatl plural, should be added to this corpus of divine representation. Somewhat paradoxically, although the informants used these terms to describe the native gods in the first books of the Florentine Codex, it is not until book 6 that we can find the presence of the devil in the illustrated vignette. In this case, we see a devil with horn taking the place of Tlaloc to receive offering in time of drought. In Book 7, to illustrate the ritual of the end of the 52-year century, which consisted of renewing domestic utensils, a vignette shows an angry man tossing out pieces of ceramic and stone, as well as a smiling European devil. A similar devil is comfortably seated on top of a man who takes him on a military expedition. the devil here taking the place of a statue or a sacred bundle borne by a priest. A devil with a serpent tail witnesses a human sacrifice, while another one appears behind the procuress who tries to convince a woman to become a prostitute. And in Book 11, a hairy devil with talons and a bird's head perched on top of a hallucinogenic mushroom, while a similar figure with a bird's head and talons, but with human body and loincloth, stands in front of a large stone that is a type of jet. The name of this stone in Nahuatl is Teutec, divine stone, undoubtedly explains the presence of the devil beside it. In the framework of this section, where the Tlatelolco augmented the use of glyphs to render the names of the stones, it would seem that the devil served here to express the word Teotl. In fact, this stone, Teotl, was used to create divine insignia, such as the mask of the fire god. Finally, we can find a devil with unruly hair and a goat, a diabolical animal, of course, inside a temple in a chapter on the different types of buildings. In fact, in the same section, we find the sole representation of Christ in the entire Florentine Codex, which represents a building called Totecuyo Ichan, House of Our Lord. Studies by Pablo Escalante and by Cecelia Klein have revealed the use of Christian models to depict, for example, representative of Ixcosauqui and Tezcatlipoca. Janet Peterson as well detected the enigmatic use of a pietà, or lamentation, as a model for a curing scene. Given the multitude of native gods, as well as faced with the broad semantic field of the word Teotl, Bernardino de Sahagún not only set about the task of refuting the divine character of the members of the Nahua pantheon, but he also attempted to delimit the indigenous concept of Teotl. Thus, when speaking of the sea, Teoatl, the Franciscan specified that this term, I quote, does not mean god of water, nor goddess of water. Instead, it means water wondrous in depth and grandeur. Sahagún explains that the indigenous people thought that the sky met the water in the sea, as expressed by the term Ilhuicahatl, but that now that the faith has arrived, and they know now that the sky doesn't meet the water or the land, and therefore they call the sea Hueyatl, which means great and fearsome and raging water. In the Nahuatl section, the Franciscan prudent informant returned to the same interpretation. It is called Tehuatl, not that it is a god, it only means wonderful, a great marvel. The informants sit and explain the name Ilhuicahatl to refer to the sea, and they conclude. But now, because of the true faith, it is only called Hueyatl. You may have noted that the rational explanation of the change in the nomenclature of the sea employed by Sahagún, the indigenous people realized their error in thinking that the sea made the sky vanished in the Nahuatl text by the Nahuatl informant, who attributed the change solely to the imposition of the new faith. We continue with the semantic field of the word Teotl and with Sahagún's effort to limit its meaning. In the prologue to Book 11, the Franciscan warns in more general terms that, I quote, "This work will also be timely to inform the natives of the meaning of creating things, that they not attribute divinity to them, because whatsoever creature they see as being eminent in good or in evil they call Teotl, which means gold. So they call the sun Teotl because of its beauty, likewise the ocean because of its grandeur, its fury, and also they call many of the animals by this name because of their frightening aspect and ferocity. From this it is inferred that this name Teotl is taken as good and as evil. And this is much better recognized when the term is a compound, as in the name Teopiltzintli, a very handsome child. Teopiltontli, very mischievous or bad boy. Many other words are compounded in the same manner, from the meaning of which it can be conjectured that this word Teotl means a thing consummate in good or in evil. The compound example that Sahagún chose to illustrate the ambivalent meanings of the word Teotl is surprising. In effect, it would seem that the difference in meaning between Teopiltzintli and Teopiltontli may be attributed more to the positive and negative connotation of the suffixes used, Tzintli and Tontli, in these cases, than to the supposed semantic valence of the prefix Teo. Be that as it may, in another part of this work, Sahagún criticized the way that the natives has attributed divinity to the dead, especially to their deceased rulers. And the ancients believed, deciding themselves, that the lords, when they died, became gods, which they used to say because the lords that ruled them were obeyed and feared. In other words, just as the devil who tricks men into venerating them, the pre-Hispanic rulers would have attempted deification in order to be feared and obeyed by their subjects. That also gave rise to the warning of the first 12 Franciscans when they spoke with the Tlamatinime, the Nahua wise men in the famed Colloquio de los Doce. We are also men. We are like you. In no way are we gods. Later in the same work, emphasis is also placed on the humanity of the Pope in Rome. From there arose the subject of the divinization of mortal in an interpretative scheme that came from Ephemeris and was revisited by the apologist and later by the father of the church to refute the divinity of the pagan gods. In another work, I emphasize Sahagún's use of ephemeris theory to disparage the native gods. For example, the Franciscan claims that the god Painal, he who being a man was worshipped as a god. Similarly, Opochtli was included among the gods known as Tlatelolco, even thought they knew that he was completely human. As for Quetzalcoatl, even though he was a man, they regarded him as a god. In the same way, Sahagún identified Huitzilopochtli and Quetzalcoatl with the deified hero Hercules, as another means of highlighting their human origin. What's more, in another part of his work, Sahagún compares King Quetzalcoatl of Tula to King Arthur among the English. Continuing with ephemeris theory, Sahagún notes the case which he regards as extreme of the goddesses called Siwapipiltin, that were also women who died in their first childbirth and who were canonized as goddesses. And the Franciscan exclaims, not without a touch of misogyny, this adoration of women is something worthy of mockery and laughter. So there is no need to speak of the confutation of the Holy Scripture by the authorities. I believe it is important to point out, just as other authors, such as Luis Burghardt and Berenice Alcántara, how Bernardino de Sahagún, as well as other friars, appropriated the term Teotl to refer to the Christian God. As far as I know, the first to use the term Teotl for this purpose was Fray Pedro de Gante in a letter dated 1529. As for Sahagún, by refuting the idolatry of the natives in the appendix to Book 1, he uses the term in Isel Teutl Ipalnemowani Dios, or the only God from whom we live, joining the Spanish word Dios, or God, with the terms Teotl and Ipalnemowani, the latter of which is employed to refer to the supreme deity. After this presentation of the Christian God, Sahagún enumerates the Nahua deities, specifying for each one Ka'amoteotl or Amoteotl, which means he is not a god. The same occurs with respect to celestial orbs such as the sun and moon, the stars, earth, and sea. In another work, the Colloquio de los Doce, Sahagún goes further in this appropriation by explaining, supposedly in the words of the 12 Franciscan, confronted by the amazed Nahua priests, that the indigenous people did not know Ipalnemowani, Tlokenawake, the true God, the Nelly Teotl. I quote, "In truth, all of them whom you have held as gods, none of them is God, none is the giver of life, because all of them are devils." Using the same nomenclature that is applied to the supreme deity, the friars establish that the God of the conqueror of the Spaniard is truly God, Tlokenawake. The European scheme followed by Sahagún and his informants to describe the ancient gods was also expressed in the order that they choose to present them, especially in Book 1 of the Florentine Codex. In another study, I propose that the division of the pantheon adopted by the Nahua informants into major god and minor deities corresponds more closely to a Western scheme than to indigenous classification. Actually, the taxonomy adopted in Sahagún's work follows a model inspired by St. Augustine's City of God, a model that has been reproduced by contemporary scholars to present the Mexican gods without questioning its Western origin. Now then, indigenous conceptions concerning the gods are clearly reflected in certain material in the Nahuatl language compiled by the Franciscan, such as the sacred hymns, which Sahagún certainly did not translate it, in prayers, as well as in diverse fragments. It is unfortunate that a short section, I quote, in which are named what were attributed to the gods in the Primeros Memoriales, has not been developed further in the Florentine Codex. It contains extremely brief definitions applied to the deity. For example, on Huitzilopochtli it reads, "He nourishes people, he makes people rich, he makes people wealthy, he makes people rulers, he is warful with people, he kills people," which correspond well to the dual visions, simultaneously positive and negative, that the ancient Mexicans had of their gods. For other Newmans, simple phrases appear, such as "he rains, he thunders, he strikes with lightning," in the case of Tlaloc. Other gods are described by a single word, blood for Atlawa, adultery for Cihuateteo, fire for Ixcosauqui, pulque for 8 different gods of pulque. And the list go on. You know, Octli. So, This brief enumeration of attributes in some way defined the essence or the most outstanding features that the Nahua attributed to these deities. Book 1 includes other interesting description. If Tezcatlipoca was inin Huelteutl ipan Mashoya, he was considered a true god, and of Chalchiutlicue, Tlaloc, and Xiuhtecutli, it is said of each one that Teutl ipan Mashoya, he or she was considered a god. For reasons that it would be worth pursuing in a more in-depth study, other deities do not reap the benefits of this divine description. In the first place, Huitzilopochtli, who is defined as only a man, a common man. Cihuacoatl, who appears as a savage beast, an evil woman. Or the Cihuapipiltin, there were 5 devils. Other comments more closely approach indigenous conceptions, such as the identification of deities as natural elements, defined as the essence of their own bodies. Water for Chalchiutlicue, corn for Xicomecoatl, turpentine for Tzapotlan-Tenen, and so forth. Deities were also associated with specific towns or social categories, such as Macuilxochitl and Xochipilli, gods of the Peles folk, Opochtli, the god of the water folk, Xipetotec, god of the seashore people, the proper god of the Zapotecs, Yacatecutli, god of the merchants, and so on. Beyond this qualifier that use the word Teotl, a profound study of the indigenous conception of the god would have to take into account the analysis of other Nahuatl terms related to Ixiptla, representative image, Yowali Ehecatl, that is linked to the invisibility of the gods, Tetzawitl, omen, that often describes deities such as Huitzilopochtli and Tezcatlipoca, and Maoistic, which expresses fear and respect, among others. These last terms naturally leads us to the polemic debate surrounding the possible divinization of the Spaniards, who in Book 12 of the Florentine Codex, as well as in other sources in Nahuatl, are called Teteo. That was the topic in the morning. Well, let's see. It's a difficult topic. Anyway, no doubt the Spaniards thought they could benefit from this opinion, as revealed by Fray Toribio de Benavente or Motolinia, I quote. The Spaniards were called Teteo, which mean gods, and the Spaniard corrupting the word used to say Teules. The name that lasted then 3 years, until it becomes clear to the indigenous people that there was no more than one god, and the Spaniards were called Christians, to which some headstrong Spaniards took offense and complained, and indignant against us, the friars. They said that we robbed them of their name. Some scholars have argued that this name given to the Spaniards was equivalent to Teoctli or Tecutli, noble. It is true that the words Teotl and Tecutli seems to be interchangeable in names of deities, such as Ometeotl, Ometecutli, Tlalteotl, Tlaltecutli, Sinteotl, Cihuateteo, Mictlantecutli, and Tlahuizcalpantecutli, among others. Nevertheless, this identification of the conquerors with deities is documented among other groups of diverse languages, both in Mesoamerica and in other parts of the American continent. Now then, instead of judging the idea that the indigenous people deify their conqueror as something degrading, it seems more appropriate to follow James Lohart's hypothesis that regard it, I quote, as another attempt to include the intruders within the existing framework and bypass, thus implicitly denying and obscuring the notion of radical distinctness. In effect, we saw that the semantic field of the word Teotl was sufficiently broad to be able to apply it into the Spaniards. In the second place, and this seems to be essential, the native perception of their gods was highly distinct from Christian conception, as Pablo Escalante said in the morning. It is worth noting that in Mesoamerica it was customary to negotiate with the gods, to beseech them and give them offering, as well as to threaten them and even to trick or insult them. It was also possible to confront a divine apparition, fight with it, and even defeat it. Therefore, describing the Spaniards as teteo did not imply any attitude of submission or defeat. In this light, I find Molly Bassett's proposal highly interesting that by donning the divine attire sent by Moctezuma, Cortés became an Ixiptla, which implied the possibility that he could be revered and or sacrificed. Meanwhile, Kevin Tarrachano proposes that the indigenous people perceive Cortés as a furious and terrifying Teotl, which does not contradict the preceding hypothesis. In effect, weren't Huitzilopochtli and Tezcatlipoca also deceitful and bloody warrior gods? For my own part, I would like to add that the fact that the conquerors came from the sea, Teoatl, divine water, and used beards like the sun god, Teotl, strange attire, in addition to their ships, horses, and weapons, which made the Spaniards exceptional beings that fit perfectly into the broad category of teteo. Another interpretation to explain that the application of the term Teotl to the conqueror is their identification as envoys or followers of Quetzalcoatl, as Henry B. Nicholson and Michel Grolich argued. In effect, the Toltecs used to say, there is only one god, Teotl, his name Quetzalcoatl. In addition, if we hypothesize that the Spaniards were somehow regarded as Toltecs, followers of Quetzalcoatl, it would be necessary to take into account that when the Toltec were among them, I quote, they addressed one as the god, my elder brother, the god, my younger brother. Whichever the case may be, the debate over the concept of deity among the ancient Nahuas continues from the classic study by Miguel León Portilla, Harriet Hitfield, Alfredo López Austin, to the more recent work by James Mayfield. As a trait to follow, I will conclude by mentioning an observation that López Austin made. There are vestiges of the relationship between blackness and divinity. The Nahuatl word Teotl, which means God, seems to have the values of blackness in some compound. According to Karen Dakin's recent etymological proposal, the word Teotl comes from the Proto-Uto-Aztecan root tura, associated with darkness and the supernatural realm. Didn't Sufi mystics in Iran maintain that black light, called oneness, represented the return to the origin, that instant prior to the separation of the one, in other words, the perfection of the mystical union with God? Thank you very much.